A recent development has sparked a fresh wave of discussions about the ongoing situation in Myanmar. Hideo Watanabe, the chairman of the Japan-Myanmar Association, has been making waves with his controversial stance on Myanmar's military regime. Watanabe, a former cabinet minister and seasoned business lobbyist, expressed support for the coup leader's democratization efforts, a position starkly contrasting Tokyo's official stance, which condemns the military violence and has suspended new aid. The 87-year-old Watanabe, who is also pursuing a $42 million shopping mall investment in Myanmar, has been a key figure in Japan-Myanmar economic ties since 1987, and his influence has been instrumental in shaping Japan's economic policy towards Myanmar. His recent comments have caused a stir, prompting several companies to part ways with the Japan-Myanmar Association, while others have distanced themselves from the Myanmar military. Regardless of these developments, Watanabe's influence remains substantial, and his position could have far-reaching implications for Myanmar's economy. Yet, despite his support for Myanmar's military regime, Watanabe has expressed some reservations and called for a roadmap to democracy and conditions for holding elections promised by the junta by 2023. This is just one piece in the complex puzzle of Myanmar's civil war. To understand the present, we must delve into the past. So let's take a brief journey back in time to the heart of Myanmar's political landscape. The story of Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is one of a struggle for power, control, and most importantly, democracy. The roots of conflict stretch back to the middle of the 20th century when the country gained independence from British rule. This was a moment of hope, of possibility. But it also marked the start of an intense power struggle between the military and the civilian government. The military, known as the Tatmadaw, took control in a coup in 1962, setting the stage for a long period of military rule which lasted until 2011. During these years, the military government made numerous attempts to legitimize its rule. It imposed strict control over the economy and suppressed any form of dissent. However, the flame of democracy continued to flicker in the hearts of the Myanmar people. This was evident in the rise of the pro-democracy movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who became a symbol of resistance against military rule. In the early 90s, the military government attempted to transition to a democratic system, but it was a democracy in name only. The military still held significant power, maintaining control of key ministries and a quarter of the seats in parliament. This pseudo-democracy led to further conflicts and tensions, particularly with ethnic minorities who had been marginalized and oppressed under military rule. Fast forward to recent years, the tension between the military and the civilian government reached a boiling point. In February 2021, the military seized power once again, alleging election fraud and plunging the country back into turmoil. The seeds sown decades ago have grown into a tree of unrest and turmoil. The roots of this conflict are deep, intertwined with Myanmar's political history and the struggle for democracy. As we look to the future, it's clear that understanding these roots is critical to untangling the complexities of Myanmar's civil war. In the theater of war, several actors play their part. Let's take a closer look at the key players in the ongoing conflict in Myanmar. First up, we have the military, also known as the Tatmadaw. The military has been a powerful force in Myanmar for decades, and their recent coup has only solidified their grip on power. Their motivations, control and continuity. They've been accused of numerous human rights abuses, including the killing of protesters. Despite the international outcry, they remain unmoved, holding on to their vision of a future Myanmar under their rule. Next, we have the elected government, ousted by the military coup. They were the beacon of democracy for Myanmar, representing the will of the people. But their tenure was abruptly cut short. Their motivation? To restore democracy and reclaim their elected positions. They've been fighting to regain control, but the military's stronghold makes this an uphill battle. Then we have the general public, the people of Myanmar. They're the ones bearing the brunt of the conflict, caught between the military's iron fist and their desire for democracy. Their motivation? Freedom and justice. They've been taking to the streets in protest, risking their lives to make their voices heard. Their courage continues to fuel the resistance against the military regime. Among these key players, we also have influential figures like Hideo Watanabe, the chairman of the Japan-Myanmar Association. His controversial stance supporting the military regime has sparked debates and drawn criticism. However, his influence on Japan's economic policy on Myanmar is undeniable. Lastly, let's not forget the various international entities and corporations whose actions or inactions can sway the balance of power. Their motivations are varied, often tied to geopolitical strategy or economic interests. These are the faces and the shadows of Myanmar's civil war. Beneath the surface, invisible currents shape the course of events. Just as the deep ocean currents influence the movement of the waters above, so too do the unseen forces of economic disparities, ethnic tensions, and international politics shape the course of the conflict in Myanmar. Let's start by diving into the economic rifts. Myanmar is a country of stark economic contrasts. The military junta and its allies control vast swaths of the economy, while the majority of the population struggles with poverty. These economic disparities fuel resentment and are a significant driver of the conflict. Next, we move on to the ethnic tensions. Myanmar is a tapestry of over 100 ethnic groups, each with its unique culture and identity. The military junta has been accused of favoring the Bamar, the largest ethnic group, causing discontent among the minority groups. This favoritism has led to allegations of ethnic cleansing and has further stoked the fires of conflict. International politics also plays a pivotal role. Take, for example, the case of Hideo Watanabe, an influential Japanese lobbyist who has urged Japan to endorse Myanmar's military regime despite international condemnation. His influence and others like him shape the political landscape and can sway the direction of the conflict. These underlying factors are like the tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface, shifting and colliding to create earthquakes that reverberate across the nation. They are complex, intertwined, and often difficult to discern, but they are crucial in understanding the ongoing conflict in Myanmar. These hidden forces add layers of complexity to the conflict. They are the currents beneath the surface, the unseen drivers of this tragic and enduring conflict. The world watches as Myanmar navigates its tumultuous journey. Myanmar's civil war is not just a local skirmish but a global concern. The international community has responded to this crisis in various ways, from sanctions and diplomatic interventions to humanitarian assistance. The United Nations, a global body tasked with maintaining international peace and security, has voiced its concern over the situation in Myanmar. It has called for an immediate cessation of violence and urged all parties to respect human rights and the rule of law. The UN has also coordinated international efforts to provide humanitarian aid to those affected by the conflict. Sanctions have been a tool used by several countries, including the United States and members of the European Union. These sanctions target key figures in the military regime and aim to pressure them into ending the conflict. However, the effectiveness of these sanctions is a topic of ongoing debate. Diplomacy has also been at the forefront of the global response. Countries such as Japan have played a significant role in shaping economic policy towards Myanmar. Despite the official stance of some governments, individual influencers and entities within these countries have called for a different approach, advocating for continued engagement with Myanmar's military regime. Meanwhile, non-governmental organizations around the world have been working tirelessly to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Myanmar. These organizations provide essential services, such as medical care and food aid, to those who are bearing the brunt of the conflict. China and Russia, two global powers with significant influence in the region, have been more reserved in their response. Their stance reflects the complex geopolitical dynamics that play into the international response to Myanmar's civil war. In the grand scheme of things, the global response to the crisis in Myanmar has been a mix of diplomatic maneuverings, economic pressures, and humanitarian efforts. Each player on the international stage has its own approach, influenced by a variety of factors including political alliances, economic interests, and humanitarian concerns. The global stage plays a crucial role in the narrative of Myanmar's civil war. As we unravel the complexities of Myanmar's civil war, we must remember that every story has multiple perspectives. It's easy to oversimplify the situation, to paint it in broad strokes of right and wrong, but the reality is always more intricate. The intricate tapestry of the conflict is woven with threads of history, politics, economics, and human rights. Each player has their motivations, each action its consequence. The path to understanding is steeped in acknowledging these complexities. We encourage you to delve deeper, to question and to engage in this global conversation. The road to resolution is not straightforward, but by fostering open and informed dialogue, we contribute to the collective effort towards peace. As we contemplate the unfolding saga in Myanmar, we leave you with this question. How can the international community effectively support the path to peace and democracy in Myanmar? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions.